everybody. Welcome back to our little special mini episodes going through the decades of the Takarazuka Revue. So I thought this week, as I'm on break, I'd move on to our next decade. We've talked about the war years, the golden age of 1950s Takarazuka. We've mentioned the horses in the great spectaculars like Gubijin, the first 2-act musicals, the introduction of portable mics and electric lighting, the start of the grand staircase. What, I can hear you asking, is ever going to live up to those exciting decades? Well, let me tell you, the 1960s were just as interesting for Takarazuka as they were for the rest of the world. Among other things, the bouffant invaded, and suddenly all the hairstyles were a good 6 inches taller. You can always pick out an Otokoyaku 1960s photo by the very large extra mass they gave the top of their comb back. It was interesting for me. I was reading through a timeline in the 60th anniversary publication from 1974, and in that particular timeline, they also put in big national and international events, like Japanese citizens winning various Nobel Prizes, major earthquakes, the date the Americans started the bombing campaign in Vietnam, Kennedy's assassination, on and on. It was odd to see that, next to which shows debuted when, which big stars retired, which productions won particularly big theater awards. And yet, even with that sparse context, I don't really know enough about what was going on in Japan in the 60s to draw a line between the social picture and how it might have influenced the Takarazuka Revue. You can see the usual obvious matches in how costumes, makeup, and hair, those bouffants, changed through the decades, of course. The late 1960s also saw the first import of Broadway American musicals by Takarazuka, and the first Broadway directors and choreographers coming over to work with the Revue. In 1967, they put on Oklahoma, followed by 2 productions of West Side Story, a wild success, in 1968 and 69. Carousel was their third in 1969. If you're a fan of vintage Takarazuka or have suffered through all of our episodes, you've probably heard some of these anecdotes before, but there are a lot of stories from the 1967 Oklahoma, for which they brought in, and I apologize, I know I'm going to mispronounce these theater names, but Dilape, who had appeared in the 1943 Broadway run as director and choreographer, and Agnes DeMille, the original choreographer. And for the 1968 West Side Story production, they brought in the original Broadway director and choreographer Jerome Robbins. Apparently, the stage eyelashes on the Otokoyaku drove the American staff crazy. Also, the Takarajane were worked extremely hard to learn the original West Side Story choreography, including some jumps and dance moves and such that just seemed impossible for their body types, especially the dance moves that were for the young men in the American musicals. But after lots of blood, sweat, and tears, they did pull it off. West Side Story played twice in the Grand Theater, running through again in early 1969. Although the Takarazuka Revue often takes famous Western operas, novels, and films, and adapts their own stage versions with their own songs, this really was their first time performing Western musicals as they were, with only small changes made to fit the translated Japanese lyrics. After these 3 successes of Oklahoma, West Side Story, and Carousel, Takarazuka went on in later decades to put on several more famous Broadway and American musicals, including Grand Hotel, Guys and Dolls, One Touch of Venus, The Sound of Music, Kiss Me Kate, and a whole host of other Rodgers and Hammerstein works. In the past 20 years, they've been extending that to European musicals such as Elizabeth and Romeo and Juliet.
Ho 寄せて踊る幸せなラストダンスよそ それは白い小指結び約束すること素晴らしい思い出にこのラストダンスをあの人の小指がささやくよ
But I've managed to get way ahead of myself. So let's rewind back to 1960. 1960 was the year that the Takarazuka Onsen underwent major changes and became Takarazuka Familyland. This theme park, right beside the Grand Theater, included electric rides, a zoo, and other attractions. In 1967, they opened a boat ride with mechanical dolls from around the world, and a theme song, One World, that's eerily reminiscent of Disney's slightly earlier It's a Small World. To mark the opening of the One World ride, there was a One World revue show put on several times by the Takarazuka Revue. Takarazuka Familyland closed its doors for good in 2003, although it had been in decline for about a decade before that. Check out our blog post for some links to video clips of the park in the 1960s. 1960 was also the year that the 3K Golden Age began, with the debut of Kozuki Noboru, Ko Nishiki, and Koshiro Miyako. These 3K ladies went on to become huge otokoyaku stars of the 60s and early 70s. In addition to being the stars of Oklahoma and West Side Story, these ladies could sing. In fact, the 60s is one of my favorite periods for lovely singing voices. Maho Shibuki and Nachi Wataru, two other otokoyaku stars of the period, were also strong singers, as was the redoubtable musumeyaku star Hatsukaze Jun. However, the musumeyaku style of singing was still somewhat more operatic than musical, and not as much to my taste. Other stars of the 60s included Yodo Kaoru, who retired early in the decade after starring in many shows throughout the 50s, Uchinoe Noboru, Kamo Sakura, and Yashioji Mari. Many of these ladies have returned for different Takarazuka specials over the years. And if you saw the OG version of Chicago in New York City a couple years ago, you would have seen Hatsukaze Jun as Mama Morton. I'll post some links to appearances in the Adu Takarazuka Grand Theater and Adu Tokyo Takarazuka Theater shows of the 1990s when they rebuilt the main theaters. You can find those in our blog. Many of the famous and often repeated songs done every year for the Takarazuka yearly specials contain songs from revues in the 1960s, including this one, The Takara-jane Are Coming, sung in 1967 by Maho Shibuki.
照る日曇る日昨日今日そして明日の幸せを宝ジェンヌが持ってくる宝ジェンヌが持ってくる風のささやき花言葉それをみんなで歌おうよ宝ジェンヌと歌おうよ宝ジェンヌと歌おうよ
1961 brought the award-winning revue show Splendor of a Thousand Beats, which also stirred up fan attention because of the very racy costume that Sumi Hanayo, an otokoyaku star, wore in her number as the Pineapple Queen that showed off her long legs to advantage. It's a costume we'd hardly blink at today, and certainly otokoyaku had played lots of onayaku parts before, but those fishnet stockings on an otokoyaku star were something very new at the time. 1962 brought, a surprising fact for me to realize, the first Tokyo Theater debut of a Takarazuka show. For the 28 years prior to 1962, all the shows put on in the Tokyo Theater were restaging of shows put on at the Grand Theater and other venues. 1962 was also the debut of Oiran and Her Son, a huge hit about a courtesan in Nagasaki, her Dutch husband/lover, and their son. It's a very bittersweet love story that was put on many times throughout the 1960s and 70s. The hits and awards kept coming. 1963 was the debut of Beside the Foggy Elbe, another bittersweet love story, this time set in Germany, and which has been revived several times as well. A Star Troupe production is currently running in the Tokyo Theater, starring Kurenai Yuzuru and Kisaki Airi. 1964 was the 50th anniversary of the Takarazuka Revue, a pretty big landmark, although not as impressive as the 100th that they hit in 2014. 1964 is also the year that they began the producer system that they use to this day. And I admit I don't know a lot about the details, but I seem to recall reading that each troupe has its own producer, or something to that effect. I'd love to learn more about it if any of our listeners have any information about the producer system in Takarazuka. 1965 was the year that they went back to Europe for their second tour there, although this time they spent the entire run in Paris. This was the first time that part of their show included a Western-style revue. All previous international tours had been Japanese-style numbers. Other international tours of the 60s included their fourth Hawaiian tour in 1966, and a really short 50-minute performance at the Plaza Hotel in New York City in 1967 to commemorate the first around-the-world route for Japan Airlines.
Love me, love me, my idol. 僕があなたを見つめたらあなたは頬をあからめて小さな声で言いましたあなたは素敵なアイドルよ好き好き好き好きあなたが一番好きなのあなたが一番好きなの
As I mentioned before, the late 60s saw the introduction of Broadway musicals and the One World revue show. 60s pop music was also becoming part of the revue shows. And 1968 saw the beginning of steady, systemized Shinjin Koen, or newbie performances. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, there had been some Shinjin Koen, although often second-tier stars rather than true younger members played the roles. Now they began having one or two Shinjin Koen performances with every Grand Theater and Tokyo Theater run. 1969 saw the push into TV with the creation of the Bambis. The Bambis was a rotating group of about 8 to 12 younger first-year members of the revue. During that time, the actresses were usually not assigned to a troupe for the first year, in any case, performing with different troupes for the experience. We have that occurring every once in a while these days as well. But these Bambi members made regular appearances on variety TV shows during that year, bringing Takarazuka into the home. Many went on to become Takarazuka stars, such as Kyo Misa, Takashio Tomoe, Itsuki Chihiro, Haruka Kurara, Tsurugi Miyuki, Ebira Kaoru, Hyuga Kaoru, and Akishino Miho. There were 15 groups in all, with the final group disbanding in 1979. And now, as we get to the very end of the 1960s, I have a little bit of Kobayashi family information to share, because I realized while researching this episode that I had been 100% mistaken on the Kobayashi family tree, and the Takawiki had reflected a lot of this misinformation. Something that I believe I forgot to mention in the episode on the 1950s, shame on me, is that the founder of the Hankyu Railway Company and the Takarazuka Revue, Kobayashi Ichizo, passed away in 1957. He was in his 80s. Now, Kobayashi Ichizo had 3 sons. His eldest son passed away before he did. His second son, Tatsuro, had been adopted by the Matsuoka family, which was a pretty common practice in the 18th and 19th century in Japan, and I guess it continued in families like the Kobayashis into the early 20th century. So, after Kobayashi Ichizo passed away, his heir was his third son, Kobayashi Yonezo. Yonezo ran or was president or vice president of several different branches of the Hankyu Corporation, including a 2-year stint as head of the board of directors of the Takarazuka Revue. However, Yonezo passed away in 1969, and he was only in his 50s, I believe. So here's where it gets interesting and where I had things confused. So Yonezo had no children. But remember the second son, Tatsuro, who was adopted into another family? Well, Tatsuro had a daughter, Yoshimi? I think that's how you pronounce her name. Yonezo adopted Yoshimi as his own daughter, and she married a successful businessman who took her family name and became the Kobayashi heir, Kobayashi Kohei. Now, I had always thought that Kohei was Kobayashi Ichizo's son, but in fact, they weren't related by blood at all. Kobayashi Kohei then took up the reins of the company for many years, until he passed away in 2010. So, the current head of the Kobayashi family, Kobayashi Koichi, as Yoshimi and Kohei's son, is actually the great-grandson of Kobayashi Ichizo, but only if you count the father who had been adopted out and the mother who had been adopted back in. Now this is some crazy soap opera level stuff right here. Well, so this was a very light look at the Takarazuka Revue in the 1960s. As we move into the next decade, we have the start of the formal top star system and the Berubara boom. So stay tuned. Many thanks to Michael B. and the Arcanum String Quartet for their wonderful arrangement of Sumire no Hana Sakugoro. And thank you, listeners, for enjoying our podcast.